Well, good morning, everybody. We are here live from Ottawa, reacting to Bill C-6, which is currently in the House of Commons. My name is Colin Postma. I'm the Federal Manager for ARPA Canada. With me is Andre Schuten, Director of Law and Policy for ARPA Canada. And then we also have Jose Ruba from Free to Care. He's the Communications Manager there. So, welcome, guys.
Thank you.
So today we want to talk a little bit about the developments on Bill C-6 that have happened over the last couple of days, over the last week or so, actually almost 2 weeks now. So the bill went into the committee stage in the House of Commons last week, and over the period of the last week and a half or so, they've heard from numerous witnesses who have spoken to this bill and discussed the impacts that will have either on themselves or on their work, the ability to do their work. So we wanted to just talk a little bit about that, the way that that's developed, and then also some of the developments that have happened just over the last day or so. Andre, would you be able to kind of recap what, or just explain to us first of all what the bill is and how they're defining conversion therapy?
Right. So Bill C-6 proposes to criminalize so-called conversion therapy. And as we've been talking about for the last year and a month, last 13 months, we've been saying that what's so important in this debate is how do you define conversion therapy? If we define it properly and narrowly, conversion therapy being a coercive therapeutic practice trying to force a change in sexual orientation, that we can agree on can be banned criminally. But what's happened in Bill C-6, originally it was called Bill C-8 back in March, this bill defines conversion therapy very vaguely and very broadly, which is causing great concern among the medical community, among the religious community, among the legal community, and we saw witnesses at the committee of the House of Commons pointing this out, that we got to fix that definition. It's way too broad, way too vague. And of course, it's going to have impacts on religious ministry, on the legal profession, on parents, on professional counselors, and so on.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I mean, the definition that's being used by the government is actually not used by any medical or professional body. So the Canadian Psychological Association, Psychiatric Association, in fact, anybody in the North American medical community or therapeutic community uses a definition that says conversion therapy is a therapy. So it's a formalized therapy that changes or forces someone to change their sexual orientation. It does not include reduction of sexual behavior. And so one of the cases that we made at the committee stage was to say, look, there are many legitimate reasons why people may want to reduce their sexual behavior of any kind, like sex addiction or porn addiction. And by adding this phrase, which nobody else uses, you're actually allowing the government to regulate people's sexual behavior.
So yesterday, they started on clause by clause. So basically what that means is that the members of the Justice Committee were going through the bill piece by piece and approving each segment of it, proposing amendments. What happened there? Andre, did you want to?
Yeah, sure. So that's where each party can make or propose amendments, right? And they do that after hearing from witnesses. So over the course of last week, Tuesday and Thursday, as well as this week, Tuesday, they heard from, I think it was 28 witnesses, of which Jose and I also were witnesses there. We heard from medical professionals, we heard from religious leaders, we heard from individuals impacted by good and effective counseling, for example, and we heard from lawyers and so on. I want to first note that of the 28 witnesses, a majority of them expressed great concern about this definition, how it would impact people personally, how it would impact negatively the profession of counselors, how it would negatively impact constitutional religious leaders and parents, and so on. And those who presented in favor of Bill C-6 were very vague or obscure or imprecise in their support for it. They would say, yeah, we support a ban on conversion therapy, but when you drill down, they rarely would say, like they often would talk about conversion therapy as a coercive and harmful practice. Again, we would say we agree with that, right?
It was interesting. A rabbi spoke, a famous rabbi in Toronto, who spoke about how he opposed coercive counseling. But when he heard the Archbishop of Toronto, who spoke before him, point out that the word coercion isn't even in the definition of the bill, you could see the change of tone in his comments, because he was more nuancing what he was saying. A social work organization came and spoke yesterday on Tuesday as well, and they were very adamant about supporting conversion therapy, but the definition they use is the same one used by the Canadian Psychological Association, which again focuses on a therapy that's about changing people's sexual orientation, not behavior. So the witnesses who came, I think, were very much either didn't know or didn't understand the wide breadth of the implication of this bill. Now, one point, though, that's really frustrating is organizations like No Conversion Canada or Dr. Chris Wells, they do understand that. So No Conversion Canada has posted on ministry pages, including mine, where they've said, we will shut down religious organizations like yours for simply upholding the biblical view of sexuality and gender identity by supporting people who want this counseling, like I have, or like some of my colleagues who spoke at. And by being able to share those positive stories, and that was actually thanks to ARPA. I wouldn't have been able to go on because I wasn't even invited as a witness, except Andre gave me half his time. So kudos to you guys at ARPA. That changed the tone of the discussion. And I think especially as the Christian community, we need to point out, we need to encourage people who have been positively impacted by counseling that would be banned by this to speak out and say, no, you're taking away my right to have a proper counseling session. Last point, I think is really key. Even therapists realize it's not their job to decide counseling outcomes for their patients, but the government thinks that somehow it's theirs. So I think that's a very important point to make. Whether you're pro-LGBT or a secular person, no one in the therapeutic community or the counseling community agrees that we ought to determine outcomes for patients. So the government shouldn't be able to do that either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like one of the MPs actually kept on saying, "Well, this bill doesn't determine the outcome for you. It's not saying you must go to counseling that only gives you this option, but it does in effect do that because it's eliminated by the power of the criminal law, which is the most severe tool that our federal government has. By the power of the criminal law, they've taken certain options off the table. They've prohibited it from being available to consenting adults and obviously completely prohibited it for any children whatsoever." So with that background then, to get to your question about what happened yesterday. So yesterday was clause by clause. So and so this is where, that committee, it's specializing in this bill more so than the House of Commons, right? House of Commons has 338 MPs, so they can't all be specialists on every single bill. So they give this committee that special mandate to study it carefully, listen carefully to the witnesses, read all of the submissions. Actually, an interesting little anecdote with this bill. It's a record breaker for written submissions to the Justice Committee. Over 250 written submissions submitted to the Justice Committee over the past 2 or 3 weeks on this topic alone.
I've heard
Incredible.
it's actually close to over 300 now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So there's actually a backlog in trying to translate those all. So anyway, this committee of 11 members of Parliament have to read all of that, hear the witnesses, and then say, okay, we've got to tweak this part of the bill here, tweak that part of the bill there, having listened to lawyers and medical experts and so on. That was their opportunity yesterday. And so what we saw was amendments being proposed by some members of Parliament. I think, for example, the Conservative Party suggested an amendment that would add the word coercion to the bill, right? We're supposed to be focused on coercive practices. That got voted down. There is no, so the word coercion does not appear in the bill. But what was particularly troubling was a joint effort by the NDP and the Liberal members of the committee, where they added to the bill in order to make it even broader yet. So what they did is they added the term gender expression to the definition. So I've listened to the testimony and the clause by clause hearing, and I've typed it up. It's not available on their website yet, but it will be soon. So it now says that conversion therapy means, okay, and it says a practice, that means in legal language, any practice, treatment, or service designed to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual, so one directional, or to change their gender identity or gender expression to cisgender. And then this part is particularly problematic. Or any practice, treatment, or service to reduce or repress non-cisgendered expression or non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior. So I'm going to ask Jojo, what in the world does that mean? To any practice that could reduce non-cisgendered expression, what would be captured by that in your opinion?
Well, this is interesting because there was a Bloc Québécois MP on the committee who was actually not friendly usually on these kinds of issues, but in this case he was. And he's the one who raised this issue with a government bureaucrat, a government lawyer, in fact, who was defending this change. And he asked her, well, okay, if my 5-year-old son wants to wear high heels and a dress and is being teased by the other boys at his elementary school, and that's 5 years old, and I bring him to counseling so that he will be discouraged from wearing high heels and a dress, would I be aiding and abetting a criminal act? The lawyer never answered that question during committee, Because gender expression, and this is something that was pointed out many times by the Conservative committee members, is not even defined in law. So even though it's been added in the human rights legislation, it's not actually something that people understand fully. I don't think even people in the LGBT community understand that fully. Mm-hmm. But that could mean something as simple as what that Bloc Québécois MP said. If your son or daughter starts dressing a certain kind of way, you tell them to stop, you bring them to counseling so they stop. That could be considered conversion therapy. You can go to jail for 5 years.
Mm-hmm. That's the maximum penalty. So, I mean, and again, like, what's a practice? So a practice understood in law means a repeated behavior. So if you do it over and over again. So if it's a one-off comment, that I don't believe that would be captured by this. But if it's a repeated thing, so let's say, let's say your daughter continues to wear lots of makeup as a 15 or a 14-year-old, and you as a parent say, you know what, you're not allowed to wear makeup until you're 16 or until you're 18. Because you're putting on too much, you're not doing it right anyway, lay off the makeup. That would probably be okay because the makeup is corresponding to her cisgendered, identity. But let's say it's your teenage son who's starting to wear mascara or wants to put on lipstick or blush or something like that, and you say to your son, look, son, like, you're just too young for this kind of thing. You're going to have to wait until you're 18 before you start putting on that kind of makeup. I don't like it as a parent. I'm uncomfortable with you doing that for whatever reason. Maybe because you disagree with that direction that your child is going down, or maybe you just disagree because you think your son is becoming too sexualized. So if you were to repeatedly encourage your son to not do that, that could fall on the wrong side of this criminal ban.
Yeah, the bill makes no distinction between a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old.
Right.
And so we need to recognize that in Canadian law, if you're 16, you can actually get married without your parents' permission, or with your parents' permission.
Right.
If you're 5 years old, according to this bill, you can change your whole gender identity and gender expression without your parents' knowledge. Right? Just think about the dichotomy of what this bill is creating for parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually a couple of the medical witnesses, professionals, doctors, raised that point repeatedly, and that is that this bill has done a horrible disservice to children because it has not drawn distinctions between age categories, which is what medical professionals do all the time. Mm-hmm. And so you had witnesses like Dr. Christopher Wells, which, with all due respect to Chris Wells, he is not a medical doctor, nor does he have any legal training, no. But they would ask him about his opinions on consent. Well, consent is a medical legal concept. It is not something that he had expertise in. And yet he gave all kinds of opinions about medical consent or legal consent, which was very, very problematic. Whereas lawyers and doctors who do deal with this concept were asked about it, and they answered differently than he did. And yet here we see in the definition, it's been changed more according to what Chris Wells thinks it should say, and less towards what the actual medical professionals and lawyers have said the way it should be.
And Dr. Wells is probably the one who helped write this definition in the first place. So we're using a definition not used by a medical person, not used by a legal person, but an activist, a sociologist who's trying to impose his agenda on the rest of Canada.
Yeah, and I think part of what's been so frustrating about this, especially developments over the last 48 hours or so, is the amount of work that went into all of the submissions and all of the witnesses that were before the committee. And then at the last moment for it to change in the way that you've described, it sort of throws a wrench into all of it would have given opportunity for those witnesses and the submissions to actually address those changes, right? So there's a bit of that where you're kind of like, okay, what's going on here, right? So addressing that, going back to the presentation you guys did last week on Thursday, Jojo, you talked a little bit about the specifics of the chill effect and sort of the impacts that would have on counselors specifically. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, part of the discussion and experiences, we've been actually fighting these laws in Alberta now for almost a year. Because as I mentioned, Dr. Wells is the one who was behind all of these laws in the first place. So the bylaws that have been passed in over a dozen municipalities in Alberta are actually almost word for word the same as the federal law. But ours is actually worse because it actually prevents counseling among consenting adults, not just for kids. And the federal Liberals were at least astute enough to say, well, that would violate charter rights. Unfortunately, municipal governments haven't had that wisdom. And so what's already happened in Calgary, for example, this is firsthand knowledge. I would know of a pastor who was scared of returning phone calls from LGBT people calling, asking for help with their sexual identity or sexual confusion, but they're afraid of the law. We have people who have talked about canceling conferences or not using biblical resources because of this. And we already know that there are pastors who are very scared of touching any kind of biblical teaching on sexuality and gender identity because of the bylaws in place in Alberta. So it's not just a wishful thinking or maybe down the road kind of thing, sort of potential scenario. It's already happening in Alberta. And so as the Christian community in particular, we need to understand this is not about banning conversion therapy. What ends up happening is you're banning conversion. Because any conversation you want with LGBT people who want that conversation, who ask, what must I do to be saved? What can I do to become a Christian? And you mention the biblical story of sexuality and gender, and you want them to get help for their sexual confusion, and they want that help. Help is now illegal. If this bill passes. And in Alberta, in Calgary, you get fined $10,000 if you offer that kind of help.
So, kind of to wrap it all up, is there anything positive that you see out of these developments?
Yeah, I mean, I am, so a couple of things. I think we can be thankful for a couple of things. First, frankly, conversion therapy is a sticky, touchy topic. It takes careful, you have to be careful in how we speak about it. We have to be winsome in how we engage on it. And it's very easy for even within the Christian community to talk about it carelessly or hurtfully. And I think that I have been, one of the things I'm so thankful for is that the Christian community has taken the time to wrestle with this question and I think is finally getting on board with why this is so concerning. But now that they're wrestling with the question, they're doing it in a winsome, loving, compassionate way. And so I was so impressed with the submissions at this committee. The second thing that I'm thankful for is that also in Parliament there has been a principled push back against this bill, where the opposition party did not run scared. Both the Bloc Québécois and the CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada, both of them raised good faith objections. They invited witnesses from across the spectrum, legal, medical, personal testimonies, religious community leaders to testify, and all of the testimony was excellent. So for that too, we can be thankful. A good witness, a good voice was presented on the concerns on this bill. And for that we can be thankful. And also, we're not done yet. We're not done yet. There's more. This bill is not passed law yet. It's going back to the House of Commons now. So there's going to be a vote in the House of Commons soon on this before it has to go through the same process in the Senate. Do you have anything?
Yeah, end of January, then the Senate. And I think what's key with this, just as we've seen in so many other issues from my experience, is the power of apologetics and really learning your perspective, learning to share it well, as you said, as winsome ambassadors for Christ, because the truth is on our side. And so the encouragement I would give you and to think about is to remember that we can't win at the political level if we can't begin to have those conversations at the grassroots with your neighbors, your coworkers, your classmates, because we're actually the ones defending the rights of LGBT people to get the counseling they choose, because we're actually defending the right of Canadians to be able to follow what spiritual path, what outcome they choose for them. We are the good guys on this. And as that message gets out, I think that mobilizes people and wakes them up to be able to want to stand on this, because if they can do this to one community, they can do this to anybody. And if I could just put a little plug here, Andre and myself will actually be speaking on January 7th, 6 p.m. Eastern Time. You can contact Andre's office or freetocare.ca. We're actually having a Zoom training event for a couple of hours. It's going to go through all of the arguments, all the training that you'll need. And here's what we'd like you to do, is take that training and then offer it to other people. Get other Zoom meetings started, because what's key, and I've learned this working with MPs and political leaders here, is they can only do so much. It's our job to mobilize at the grassroots level. And I think what I've been seeing with this is, as we explain just the gravity of this law, more and more people want to get involved. And this is an opportunity for us to make a political difference that will protect the church, protect LGBT people, protect kids, and be able to say to the community broadly, look, as Christians, we want the common good for everybody. We're not here trying to impose a theocracy. We want to be able to share good news about what we believe to everyone.
Mm-hmm. So where do we go from here? Well, the bill from this point passes on to the House of Commons. They will be adjourning, I believe, today, if they haven't already. And that will be it for essentially the Christmas break and then right through most of January until they sit, usually somewhere at the end of January again. So that's when we will be ramping up again to just get our supporters and those across the country to reach out to their MPs for when it goes to the final vote at the third reading in the House of Commons. Then from there it goes to the Senate, of course, and there will be additional action items related to that. For more, and if you want to reach out to your MP today and do so, you can go to easymail.arpacanada.ca, or you can find a written letter that you can also send to your MP on this subject at arpacanada.ca/C6, and at that address you can also find other action items. So that's arpacanada.ca/C6. That's it from Ottawa. So thanks very much for watching. Have a great day.
Thanks.